live.
Hey everybody, this is Robert Castillo. I'm excited to here with uh, Eric Bean. He's the director of high performance at Higher Echelon. He's also worked with a variety of performers, um, Navy SEALs, Special Forces, but as well as business executives and athletes. So I'm excited to welcome him and join our conversation about human performance, all things that help people get better and improve. Thanks for joining me, Eric. How are you doing today?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm good. I'm good, man. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Appreciate it for asking. Yeah, yeah. End of the week, long week, but yeah, things are going good. So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into the field, and a little bit about kind of the work you've done.
Yeah. So I'm a high performance coach, and I work with individuals, teams, and organizations to help them, perform at a higher level more consistently. And so my background is actually in sport and performance psychology. I have a master's and a PhD in that. And after my PhD, I went to work with the Army. So it was the first time I really sort of transitioned from working with just almost strictly sport athletes to working in a different performance domain. And so that kind of opened my eyes up to the reality and to the possibility of this field, and starting to look at it more as performance psychology rather than just strictly sport psychology.
Yeah,
And I worked with the Army for a number of years, and a variety of populations within the Army, from wounded warriors to infantry to special forces, but I actually did quite a bit of work with surgeons. I worked at Joint Base Lewis McChord, which has the second largest training hospital, Madigan Army Medical Center. And so I helped start a program there, working with a variety of specialties in the surgical domain, along with emergency physicians. And I love that work. And I got again to see another example of the kind of content and topics that we would teach in sports psych applied to and being effective in another performance domain. Then I came down to San Diego to work with the Navy SEALs, did that for a little bit. Then I went internal to UCSD Health. I was an internal leadership consultant there, starting to work more and more with leaders throughout my time at both with the Army and then also with the Navy and then with UCSD Health. So now I've been in my current role as the director of high performance for Higher Echelon for the last almost 5 years. And I work again, like I said, with individuals, teams, and organizations. I'll do executive coaching. I'll do group coaching, on kind of the mental game of performance, whatever your performance domain is.
yeah, awesome. Thanks for that introduction.
That was kind of a long.
I love that. No, it's great. It's great. I love it. And really one of the things that I like that you highlighted was that transition from sport to the military, right? And that they apply, right? So things I'm sure imagine
Right.
now that you have worked in those populations that you've been able to transfer some of that information back to maybe some of the athletes or CEOs that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I looked at when I was working with, early in my career, I was working with athletes and I was kind of skill focused, and I was really like, what's the skill that's going to help them, whether it's pre-performance routine, refocusing strategies, dealing with and working with confidence, those kinds of things. Um, and and through my work with, through my experience over the years, I've started to kind of shift away from a more traditional skill set, skill focused, skill based approach. And I really got that from my experience working with leaders, working with different populations, and worked more towards, what are the mental and emotional patterns and habits that are interfering with the execution of the skills, right? Because by now, most people understand the value of either mindfulness or deep breathing or refocusing techniques, but there's still something getting in the way. So that's really where my shift has helped, and that's also influenced my work with athletes, as you're talking about.
Yeah. Pattern net recognition, right, is huge in what we do. Being able to identify things, the sticking points, right? Because a lot of us know what we should do for a performance perspective, but we may not know either how to do it specifically in that context, or something else is getting in our way, whether it's our thoughts or some other, you
Yeah.
know, obstacle, right? So being able to identify, I always talk about being curious, right? Is a big watchword of mine that I try to work with my clients, is just be curious about yourself, like what's going on, so you can develop that
Hmm.
self-awareness to help. What are you noticing, if anything, with across the populations that you're working with right now in dealing with our current global situation?
I think I want to jump back before I answer that question. Like you're
Yeah,
saying,
yeah,
like knowing is not enough. Knowing what to
yeah,
do is half the battle, if maybe even less than half the battle. Being able to
yeah,
do it when you need to do it, when it matters the most, is really where you see the separation. And I saw that at every level with every type of performer that I've ever worked with. Most of them know what to do, but then being able to do it when it matters the most, that's where some people struggle. I saw it even with
yeah,
surgeons, where they could recite every step that they needed to take. They could talk about how they would do it. They would perform well on the board exams, but in a surgery under pressure with the attending that they don't like watching over them, they struggle to execute the skills that are necessary to get them to the level of performance that they want to and need to be at. To answer your
yeah,
question about what I'm seeing right now, I've seen an evolution of this over the course of time here as we've gone through, and this is, as a colleague calls it, the now normal.
yeah,
This period of adjustment that people have gone through early on. People were so there's like, it's almost like there's adrenaline in the system, and you're like, okay, the kids are at home now, I'm working from home, and there's all this like kind of energy that's helping you figure it out and adjust, and then that dissipates and you settle into this reality, into this new normal, and there's still this kind of longing for the old way. I was on a call the other day with a executive friend of mine, and one of the things that he's noticing with his team is they're regularly trying to compare today's success or today's results to pre-COVID,
yeah.
right? And
Hmm.
and and he and I had a discussion about this last week, about you can't do that. You've got to be
Right.
focused on what does success look like right now, right? If we
Yeah.
get into that comparison mind of what it looked like pre-COVID, we're going to be constantly, running on that hamster wheel. We're going to be chasing that because right now the conditions are different. So
Yeah.
you're comparing apples to elephants here, right? I mean, it's just there's two
Right.
very different situations.
Yeah.
And so I think for him, getting into the frame of mind of like, what does success look like right now? What's a home run look like right now? What does a base hit look like right now? Because it's different than what it looked like 3 months ago, 2 months ago. And then being able to shift his team and his organization to have that same mindset and focus, I think alleviates some of the stress. If the leader at the top is doing it, it alleviates some of the stress down below.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that. Apples to elephants.
What
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. But one of the
are you
things that
seeing?
yeah, it's similar, right? And so what I was going to add to that is the emotional piece of that, right? Is like that stress, like how does it represent, or how does it come out, right? And right now there's a lot of emotional responses to that, of trying to measure themselves to what they were doing before and not changing it, and then that creates, whether it's frustration, anxiety, and so that learning to manage those emotional responses in this time where you maybe don't have access to all your resources, uh,
Right.
it makes it even that much more challenging, right?
Yeah.
And you and I are doing a book club together,
Yeah.
and it reminds me of some of the things we're reading. Eric posted on Twitter, I don't know, maybe at the beginning of this whole COVID thing,
It really was. Yeah.
who wanted to do a book club, and I was like, yeah, let's do it. And we are reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, right? And what you're talking about reminds me of some of the things we're learning in that is, how do you shift perspectives? You're in this new normal, right? And how do you take control of what you can and try to adjust to what you're thinking, what you're focused on, what the goal is, and how that changed over a stressful situation. So, yeah, those are
I
some of
think
the
your
things.
point. Sorry to cut
Yeah,
you
go
off
for
there.
it.
Go ahead.
No, you're good.
I think I think your point about like the same coping resources aren't available to us that were pre-COVID. There's like
Right.
a meme early on that was like, reach out to your extrovert friend. They need you right now. Because like, and that's something that some people, that's their kind of one of their coping mechanisms might be
Mhm.
that physical in-person connection with people, and that ability to sort of step away from your office or your desk and go talk to a coworker, or go have lunch, or you know uh, start happy hour a little earlier than usual, whatever it is. Right, those coping resources aren't all available to us, and so we have to adjust in a number of ways. We've got plenty of factors contributing to our emotional state, and then we've got to figure out new ways of adapting that we haven't had to do before, of how to manage and cope with those emotions. So I think that's really the bigger challenge here, particularly when there's so many unknowns. Right, if we know, okay, like an athlete, I know for a fact I'm going to go back to campus August 1st or whatever it is. Right, that alleviates a lot of my anxiety, because I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I know, what's ahead of me. I know it might look different when I get there, but we don't have those answers right now, right? And so then I've got to
Yeah.
figure out, how do I deal with that unknown in addition to all the other kind of emotional challenges that I'm going through, without the coping resources that I'm accustomed to.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. The other thing that I've noticed, as it relates to what's going on right now is I, we're doing a lot of comparison, right? So if things are
Hmm.
relatively okay for you, you still have a job, your kids are healthy, maybe nobody in your family is sick. Um, People are still experiencing stress. You and I have had conversations offline of just homeschooling kids, and right, and that's in reality it is a stress comparison to other people's situation, not that right. Uh,
Right.
However, it's still stressful, right? So I would say there's this like blanket on top of everybody, no matter where you fall
Right.
on that spectrum, right? Like if you've lost work to, things are okay, we're still in this new normal as was described. And I think we're maybe not recognizing its impact on us, particularly for those folks that are relatively, unaffected by this, right? Beyond having impact on your social life, right?
Yeah.
And I think recognizing that, I had two conversations this morning with two different clients, unrelated, right? But similar concepts, right? They were dismissing that pressure and that stress of having to be at home time, not having access to their friends or family in the same way they did before.
You know, I like that metaphor of like the blanket. A colleague of mine, Dr. Shannon Baird, and good friend, she used to talk about how, we all have this like baseline of stress. This isn't new, you'll know this stuff, but we all have this sort of
Yeah.
baseline of stress. And if we move from like, farmland next to, a big loud city with active train tracks, our baseline increases, our baseline level of stress increases. the that's not so much the problem. We don't notice that quite as much. The challenge becomes, our acute stressors are starting off of a higher level, right? So when we have a
Right.
stressor of a kid, um, back talking or not behaving or whatever it is, we're starting off of a higher level of stress than we normally do. And so then that acute response is more exaggerated or more significant than it would be if we were in kind of, pre-COVID or normal, whatever that is, conditions. And so we're
Right.
all going through this kind of adapting period where we might recognize, gosh, that I really reacted in a way that I normally wouldn't have reacted. That's that same situation 3 months ago. I was calm. I just responded to my kid, and I took a deep breath or whatever it is. But now I'm yelling, and everybody else is yelling, and all those things. And so I think it's recognizing and owning that it's okay, because our baseline has leveled, or we've got that blanket hanging over us.
Yeah. And so what are you working on with people to help them manage this and get the blanket off, right? And or deal with the blanket more effectively? Are there any specific strategies that you're um, talking to folks about and trying to help them understand things that they can do?
I think one of the big thing that I'm doing a lot of these days, I think a little bit more than usual, is for some it's kind of a refresher into the mindfulness space and into meditation. For others, it's a kind of a deeper dive than they had before, or it's brand new. So that's kind of a big one. I know that's kind of an obvious low hanging fruit one, but that to me is a big one. I've got a client of mine who, you know, we were talking and he was sharing how he's kind of stressed and spinning a little bit and he we had worked prior and he worked well on and responded well with meditation and mindfulness practices. And I asked him, "Are you still doing your mindfulness practice?" "No, there's no time." And I said, "When there's no time, that means you need to do it more." Right? I think there's the Dalai
Yeah,
Lama who
yeah,
said when he's at his busiest, he doubles his meditation practice.
right.
And I kind of got on him about it, and those are one of those things. That's one of those things that we can control, and we know is going to help us. And but we feel this pressure right now. Like one of the things that I'm noticing is that home and work life, there's not a clear separation, and so I think people are having trouble
Yeah.
with kind of finding their own time. And I did as well, and I do sometimes as well. It's
Mm.
because I know that if I'm not working, I've got to go help the kids, or I've got to go do the
Mhm.
dishes, or I've got to go do some homework, or do that kind of thing. And so it's harder. I think it's becoming harder to find time for yourself, and for some to justify that time for yourself. Um, so that's one of them. Another one of them that I'm working on and people are responding well to is certainly going to be a gratitude practice. Um, I've got a former client who reached out and said, "Would you mind that just kind of being an accountability partner in my gratitude practice, where she texts me every day, her three gratitudes for the day." And one of the things that does for me is it enables me to kind of see some of the patterns that are going on with her, and I can sort of sometimes sense like where she's sort of reaching for things that she's grateful for, and other days where it's coming a little bit more naturally. Um,
Mhm.
those are, I think, the two big ones that are being, kind of at the top of my list when we're talking more like strictly skill based. If we go
Yeah.
back to that concept I was talking with a little bit earlier about like our patterns and that kind of stuff. Um, Another element that I'm talking with and working with people a lot on is perspective. Um, Pre-COVID conditions, it's kind of easy to have an opportunistic perspective or solution focused perspective. Um, During this now normal, some people you see a little bit more of the victim mentality popping up, or you even see a little bit more of the conflict mentality or problem focused mentality. So just exposing the shift in perspective and the lens through which people are seeing the world, I think helps with that shift, right? Because if
Yeah.
I'm looking through a victim lens, right, everything's going to feel like a threat. I'm not going to feel like I have any control, right? And just by shifting that lens that I'm wearing at, I can start to see opportunities. I can start to see where I have control, so on and so forth. What about you? What are the big ones you're working on?
So all three perspective, mindfulness, dude, those are things that I've shared with some of my clients. But the other one that I've so for one of the nations I work with, we put out a 30-day breath mindfulness relaxation program, right? So each day
Yeah.
we gave them and it was just a link to a YouTube clip. And one of my favorite ones is like I call it alternative, um, you know, relaxation techniques, and one of them is called laughing yoga. I don't know if you're familiar with laughing yoga,
Mm,
but it's basically making yourself laugh, right? And so, but you compare that with humor. So really, one of the clients I was working with today and yesterday, for that matter, we talked about how do you introduce humor into your day, right? Because everything's so serious, looking at the news constantly, numbers, job, etc. Um,
yeah.
and you know, and that perspective taking, right? Victim, conflict, all those different you know, potential ways we can look at the world. How do you introduce humor? So uh, laughing yoga is real simple. Is you force yourself to laugh, and after you start laughing for a little bit, that laughter can turn into genuine laughter, right? And then obviously all the things that come physiologically with that, you know, reduce muscle tension, decrease heart rate, you know, a lot of the things that we would want from a relaxation standpoint. But the other thing is just, if whatever you find humorous, try to watch some of that, right? So YouTube clips. I'm a big Will Ferrell
Yeah.
fan, so I'll pull up his, you know, highlights from SNL days, right? And I'll just watch
Yeah.
4 or 5 minutes of that, laugh a little bit, and that kind of changes my perspective or helps me give me a little bit of a break. So that's one, and then the other one, games. You know, just kind of doing something fun with your mind to distract yourself, right, and give yourself a different focus. So I personally play a game of solitary, old school solitaire. Um, and it takes me 2 minutes. It's engaging enough where it focuses my mind, but not so challenging where I get frustrated by playing it, right? Because
Right.
I also
Right.
play video games, and that's frustrating to me sometimes because I'm losing, right? Probably getting, you know, I play online, I probably get beat by a 14-year-old, but
Yeah.
so that one is not relaxing for me. But that solitaire is, on average, it plays like 3 minutes, right, at a time. It takes me to play a game of solitaire.
Right.
So so yeah, those are some of the things, and those are kind of the ones in addition to what you brought up are ones that I've been focused on with some of my clients, and they seem to be responding well to it, particularly the humor
I
one.
love that. I love the
Yeah,
humor one. I'm gonna start to practice that one. We've got a like, I'm on a bunch of text chains. I think that's like one of the things that's sort of
yeah,
different now than I'm like in some regard more in contact and more connected than I was previously. And some of those are pretty fun and light and I enjoy the daily memes that come out, and all that. But I like that laughing yoga. I was thinking more of it like me laughing at myself doing yoga, which is comical.
yeah,
Um, but I like that idea, and then certainly the games. I'm sure Avery and Harrison, my sons, will love the gaming one. They already do it enough.
yeah.
Um, but luckily, I can still beat Harrison at Mario Kart. He's
There you
4,
go.
but so I,
Yeah,
I think I've got maybe another 3 months of that
there
reign
you go.
over him.
Right, right, right. I love it. I love it. Yeah, and you bring up the kids, right? So for those of us that have kids, I remember doing some, like, a 30-day challenge. This was a couple years ago, of every day doing 5 minutes. Start your day with a meditative practice, and they would change. And on day like 20, the guy running through is a video program. You know, he's like, if your kids come into the room, just have them join you, right? And for the first 20, 18 days, 19 days, I was like, get away from me. I'm trying to be mindful,
Right,
right? And
right,
then on day
right.
20, they were like, hey, if your kids come, and have them join you, or if they're jumping on you, make it a game, and then be mindful with that. And I was like, I wish you would have told me that day one, right? So it was such a
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
simple reminder, but how do we include the people around us as opposed to, because we can fight them on it, right? And say, hey, no, I need this. And if they're not, particularly kids, young kids, or may not give you that space, even if you're asking for it. So then just make them a part of it. And so, like, that laughing yoga, we'll do it as a whole family. And obviously, it's with kids, they take it up a notch, right? And it's
Yeah,
makes
yeah,
it
for
even
sure.
funner, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I
Um,
think I think the one thing we've done, I forget where I read this, but the concept of like a digital Sabbath, and so
yeah.
because right now it's intense with regard to the iPads and obviously
Hmm.
all the screen time we're getting, and like the idea of my kids' like perfect day is like 8 hours on the iPad and take a break and watch a
Right.
movie on TV. Just like, ah.
Right.
So
There
we've
you go.
done we've done a couple of them now where we do a digital Sabbath, and we'll basically take off like the entire day, a 24-hour period away from screens, and Nicole and I do it as well. And it's been great. And actually, we've played some games. We found some good games that are like suitable for a 4 and an 8-year old. Um, and then we've enjoyed that time together where we'll definitely laugh and have fun and reconnect. So finding a way to incorporate them has been really fruitful for us in terms of connection and being able to stay connected, and then lighten it up a little bit,
Yeah.
because it's like it's hard to hear your 8-year-old, say like he wants to go somewhere, and then we say we can't, and then his response is because of COVID, and we're like, yeah, or because of the coronavirus, he says, and so we're like, yeah, and it's true, but it's just still difficult even now, 3 months in, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. We did a socially distant birthday party with our 8-year-old. So she got invited. So we all went, but we are all staying away from each other.
Yeah, yeah,
And, I need it. You mentioned extroverts, right? Reach out to your extroverted friends at the beginning of this, talk. To see my kid, like light up even at a distance from seeing a friend, somebody they know. I mean, it was huge, right? It
yeah,
made me happy for him in the moment, but also sad that this is kind of where we're at right now, right? But
right.
it was good for them to interact in that safe and socially responsible way, better than nothing. But yeah, I mean that screen time and getting away, I think is huge, and hopefully we can do that continuing even after COVID, right? And where
Well,
we're
I think one of the
trying to
things,
be more mindful. Yeah,
yeah, I think one of the things is like we know we're social creatures. We know that we need that interaction. And I think this is actually, to me, it's been at least evident that, Zoom is a nice if you have to, right? If you have to do it, it kind of works, but it doesn't fulfill our need for human interaction, social interaction. It gets us closer, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And so I'm kind of thinking about and curious about how this young generation and these generations to come are going to kind of sway that pendulum back a little bit, right? Because we saw the sway with social media go where it's like all social media, no human, and now we're kind of coming back a little bit where there's a balance. And I think this is an impetus to that. This is helping in some regards, or at least I
yeah,
hope it is helping that.
yeah. I think this is very tangential, but I
Right.
think you might find it interesting perspective. Is So the idea of like all these difficult like type trainings, like physical trainings, like CrossFit, but then you have the Spartan races and the Tough Mudder. I think
Hmm.
that's a pendulum swing of like we've gotten too soft. So in our entertainment, we have to push ourselves and create some stress in our lives because we're pretty cushy, at least in the U.S., right? And so
Good point.
for a
Yeah.
lot of us, and so I think that pendulum swing of like things have gotten so potentially easy for us that we have to find these other ways, and hopefully that we're seeing that from the perspective you're taking, right? We're so engaged in these screens that realizing, hey, I haven't seen my friends for so long. I don't
Right.
want to see them on a screen. I want to go interact with them, right,
Right.
and hang out
Right.
and connect with people. So we'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see what happens. I know I'm feeling. I'm an extrovert, and I get a lot of energy from others, and so uh, that's in part of why I wanted to do some of these calls is to interact with
Yeah.
people. Yeah, and my wife is an introvert, so she's loving it, right? She goes on her solo runs. She
Yeah.
loves being by herself, and she gets a lot of energy from that. So she's like, "Yeah, I'm good. Things are
Right.
if we could stay like this, I'd be okay, right?" And I was like,
Right. Right.
"I need to see people, right?" So yeah, you were talking about the kids, and this is maybe an odd segue, but I'm still going to make it. Is you're doing a podcast called Coaching Through Stories, right? Why are stories so impactful, right? I know we read our kids' stories, we love stories, but from your perspective, like why'd you go that route when you're creating this podcast of using stories as your method to teach?
I think stories are serve as like an anchor. I think they really help us. Jim Lair wrote a good book, The Power of Story. I think they really help us sort of cement a lesson in and help us learn from that story. I think that's what they do. They illuminate lessons in a way that's abstract, and it's sometimes out there and seemingly disconnected, but it gets pulled together, and so we can remember the story. And then what I believe that enables us to do is if we can remember the story, then we can go a step further and look at and examine what that story is trying to share with us or what that story is trying to teach us. So when I work with individuals and teams and groups, I obviously share and use a lot of stories in my coaching and in workshops and those kinds of things. But I'm also hearing and receiving a lot of stories from people, stories about how they, came to this line of work, or stories about how their leadership philosophy or their approach to leadership was formed. It's a guy that is a little rough around the edges, but then when you start to realize his story is, he worked on an oil tanker, for 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. And, there wasn't a lot of time when decisions had to be made. There was very direct instruction. There wasn't a lot of consensus gathering, you know what I mean? And so
Right.
now you can kind of understand a little bit more about why he is the way he is, or how he approaches leadership in the way he does. So to me, that was something that when we were talking about what to work on or how to focus this podcast, that was something that when that idea came up, I was like, this is a great idea. Let's go with this. And what we found, I think, through it is that people that are listening to the stories of CEOs or whoever we have on are connecting with something within themselves, to either an experience that they had similarly, or a story in their life that is now like, oh yeah, that experience really did shape a core value of mine. And now I've got a connection as to why that's so important to me. It's not just the value, but it's the why. It's the reason underneath the value. And if I have that awareness of that story, then I can get stronger conviction into that value. And so to me, that was why I wanted to go down that path.
I love that saying, that the reason behind the value. That's great. Yeah, and that can change, and we can understand ourselves and others through those stories that we're hearing or experiencing for ourselves. What makes a good story in your mind? Like what are some of the ingredients from your perspective?
Oh, Hollywood writers make great stories. I think that's really where it's at. I'm not necessarily like looking for like a good story in terms of like, the
Yeah.
hero's journey or that kind of thing. But one of the things that I think makes a valuable story, I don't know if it's necessarily like Hollywood worthy or whatever, but a valuable story is one that evokes emotion. And whether that evokes emotion in the person telling the story or the people receiving the story, to me makes it again a valuable, I don't know if I necessarily say good, but a valuable story, because it's from that emotional place that we can gain some self-awareness. We can explore, what is it about that story that is triggering this emotion, whether the emotion is anxiety, love, hope, fear, whatever that emotion is. Then that emotion acts as a catalyst for us to explore ourselves. And so to me, that's really when I'm experiencing and hearing a story or telling a story, I'm sometimes looking for that emotion that it evokes. And that, I think, enables the cementing, as Michael Gervais talks about, the clarity to conviction. It enables that clarity, which sets you up for a path to conviction in those values.
Yeah, and that's I asked the question, but my intention was to understand. We teach through stories, is what you're trying to do within your podcast. But as leaders, we're also teaching through stories, right? When we're explaining to somebody, we're doing it in a story. And so the reason because I don't think many of us, or some of us, aren't very good at that, right? So from a leadership perspective, we'll give either guidance or advice or try to mentor somebody, and sometimes we're not invoking that emotion, right? We're not either listening to the emotion that's coming from within us, or that we're trying to get from the person we're telling the story to. And that piece of advice will serve a lot of leaders well, is to think about, what emotions either do I want to have, or do I want the person that I'm telling this story to have? And that could frame how they're telling that story, right? And so I think that's great advice, right? To hear from somebody who listens to a lot of stories. Yeah.
I absolutely think so, and I think for leaders who speak, publicly, whether it's through a town hall or whatever it is, the thing that you're pointing out here that's really important to me is who's the story for, right? Is the story for me as the storyteller, or is it for them? And if I can then take their perspective and think about what might they resonate with, what do they need to hear in this time, and then what story can I tell that will help them get there, right? That'll help them get to where we want to get as an organization or as a team. And so I think that's an important thing for leaders as well, is to not only think about, as you put it so eloquently, the emotion that we want them to experience, but also what it is about the person receiving the story that will, like, taking that perspective, that will help them get to that emotion, right? Because I might tell a different story for the guy that worked on an oil tanker, right, as I would tell for for somebody that grew up in rural Alabama or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I worked with baseball players, but I worked primarily with the Latin, Spanish speaking players, and
Right.
their experience is different, right? And so those cross cultural references don't always work, right? Like a story. I do a lot of work with the military, and I remember the higher ups were like, "Tell them about your experience working with this group or that group," and I was like, I
Right.
don't think it's going to resonate well. And so they
Right.
introduced me as that, and they added that piece to my bio of, "Hey, Robert worked with the military," and they all looked at me like, that didn't build trust, because in
Don't
some of
care.
their
Right.
countries, yeah, and not only that they
Good
don't care,
point.
but in some of their countries, the military is not viewed in high regards, right? And
Good
so
point. Yeah.
so I quickly shifted from that, right? So any of those stories were non-usable, right? So I had to
Right.
think
Right.
about other examples, right, to help them understand the concepts. But yeah, you have to take all those things into play when you're telling a story. Who's it for? What's the intention? What's their background, right? And that'll to help them resonate. Um, you know, we watch America's Got Talent with the family, and they do the packages before the actual performance.
Right.
And there are times where, like, I'm getting teary eyed, right? Like, I'm listening to the story, and my wife is over there like stone cold, like, yeah, whatever. And then vice versa, other times, like, resonates with her, like, yeah, whatever, it's not that big of a
Right.
deal. And so
Right.
that context matters. And then how we express their performance is also different. That influences based off of that story. And so all that kind of just reminds me of a lot of the work that we do, right? Is tapping into emotions, managing emotions to drive behavior and motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing too that I've realized more and more through the podcast is that we all have stories. We all have these life experiences that are um, you know amazingly meaningful to us, to me, to the person telling the story, but they
Yeah.
might not have that same meaning to other people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't mean the story isn't valuable or the story isn't good, right? It just means that it didn't register, it didn't connect with them. And so I think that's a really important thing for a leader, to be able to explore the different stories that they have in their lives, and then be willing to share those, dependent on who the person or the people are that you're speaking it to.
Yeah. The other thing that you just mentioned, that for some people, I think sometimes people don't value their own stories, right? Their own experiences, and
Exactly.
they
Yeah.
undercut it, right? I met a soccer mom, we'll just call her. She was starting CrossFit, right? And she was trying to do the box jump, right? And they started her off with like a 4-inch box jump, so just like
Right.
basically a step, right? And she was struggling. She was probably early 50s, and she struggled, and she finally got it, and she into tears, excited about herself.
Awesome.
And mental skills coach comes over, and she's like, I'm so embarrassed. It took me so long. I'm proud, but I'm also embarrassed. I can't believe I let myself get to the point that I'm so out of shape that I can't jump on things. And I questioned similar to, like, tell me your story. And what she told me was, I was blown away that she was, for the last 5 years, has been taking care of a sick child that had cancer, right? And I was like,
Mhm.
time out. like you're a badass, right? Like what you've done, what you've been able to
Mhm.
do to keep your family together, to overcome and thrive in spite of what you're going through. uh, you need to leverage that as opposed to viewing it as you've let yourself get out of shape, right? That's a piece of this, but you've done so much that's great. And I felt like she didn't value her own story and what she had done until it was pointed out in that perspective. So
You know,
that helped her quite a bit.
the other thing that's coming up for me as you share that is that idea of like, we fill in the gaps, right? So we see something, we see her, jumping up on the 4 inch or 6 inch box or whatever it is, and then we tell ourselves our own story. Whether like, oh my gosh, why is she having such a hard time with that? That's not that big of a deal. Um, and so I think that's something that leaders can sometimes struggle with, is that that their people, the people that they're leading, the team that they're leading, whoever it is, only sees a certain side of them. So I got some feedback actually from a guest that I had on, and one of the things that he shared was that a lot of people in his organization listen to the podcast, and they kind of leaned further in because of what he shared. A lot of them said to him, "Well, I didn't know that about you, and now that I know that about you, it helps me better understand you. It helps me better understand where you're coming from, and it helps me better, buy in more to your vision and your purpose." And I think that's something that is a hopefully a motivation to share your stories, right? And if that lady hadn't shared her story with you, you might have made your own judgments or own, assumptions about her. But now that you know that about her, that accomplishment is so much bigger, right?
Right.
That 4 inch box jump is now, 4 feet, right? Because of
Right.
the story, because of the background. And so that's, one of the things that I love about, hearing people's stories and hearing the kind of the behind the scenes that we don't normally see.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, great stuff. I love that. Right. It's text. Right. And then it makes me, this is what we do. Right. We just what it sparked in my mind was when companies get bigger and organizations or teams, right, you have success and new members come in. If we don't know the story and understand the culture that we're coming into it, and I think some organizations will put a vision statement or a mission statement, and they're not adding any context to that vision or mission to anybody new coming in, and then that person doesn't enculturate effectively because um, they're missing information, they're missing context, right? And the
Yeah, it's
story's not there.
wonderful.
So I tell leaders, like, even if you think somebody has heard this or knows it, tell it again
Right.
because it's going to hit
Right.
them differently. It's a different day. It's might be a different person. It might be the same person, but they're just in a different mental space, and that story might resonate with them differently.
Yeah, and I think it's a old Zen statement that I say quite often. You can't step in the same river twice, and either
Right.
you have changed or the river has changed. And so that idea of being open to and then hearing a new, that context that you talked about, I love that. I think that's such a great point because people just see the vision statement, and perhaps the assumption is that because we work so hard on the vision statement, because it's crafted so beautifully and every word is,
Right.
we talked about for a half an hour or an hour or 3 hours,
Right.
and we've got it perfect, that people are going to read that and understand all the stuff behind it, right? and
Right.
and and feel it on the same deep core level that we feel it on, and that's just not the case. And so being able
Yeah.
to share that, I think, is a great thing. And then, like you said, share it again because it might hit them a little differently. It's something that I think
Yeah.
about with organizations as they progress, and transform. And obviously, right now we're in a serious um, a time of transformation. Is that is not only the how we got here, but why we got here and why we went this way, but then also where we want to go and why we want to go there. I think sometimes people
Yeah.
struggle with the organization that makes a shift from either a founder mentality, scrappy, everybody's, all hands on decks, people are doing all sorts of different things, to one that's a little bit more, people have their kind of their lanes and their specialties and their expertise. And so I think the point is to say, like, this is a time of transformation. Here's why I think we're making this transformation. Here's the impetus for this transformation. And here's where I think we're going. Here's where I believe we're going and why we're going there. And so then being able to get people to see that whole picture and that whole evolution, if you will, is important for that buy-in and that context that you're talking about.
Yeah. I think that's great. I've been wanting to ask somebody that's in our field about have you watched The Last Dance? Have you been keeping up with the Michael Jordan documentary?
Yeah.
I'm curious to get another sports psych, performance psych,
to get my hot take on it.
Yeah. What did you think? What were the takeaways for you?
So I think that a number of takeaways for me. One is, I think I had known this, but not to this degree. How Jordan was really driven by, to me, it became evident that he was really driven by vindication. And so he would look for, the tiniest of slights and use that, even if it wasn't real, like that one point where the guy's like, I just said, hey, good game. And like the next day, Jordan thought that was like the biggest slight ever and uses that. Yeah. But to me, the thing that's really interesting about that is that I think Jordan, was willing to find motivation from any source, whether it was his own internal drive to be better, whether it was an extrinsic reward, whether it was a slight from somebody else. And I think sometimes in our field, we get so focused on like intrinsic motivation, right? It's got to be driven from within. You've got to have a clear why. Yeah. And that's the cleanest fuel that you can use and all those things. Sometimes we need external motivation, right? Sometimes we need a perceived slight to get us through the next day, to push us through that workout or whatever it is. So I thought that was something that was really interesting. I certainly thought his approach to leadership was interesting. And I wish there was a little bit more discussed about that.
Right.
I'm blanking on that guy's name, who the tall center who they brought in to be kind of co-captain. I don't know if you remember that part, but to kind of balance out Michael's uber competitiveness, this guy came in with a little like softer arm around the shoulder approach. And it speaks to, one of the other things that I think is really coming up for me is that, there's a leader for everybody. Some people are going to really respond to Jordan's leadership and really thrive in that kind of challenge, competitive environment, and other people that aren't, and other people that are going to thrive in an environment that is more collaborative, that is more mastery focused rather than ego focused, those kinds of things. So I think there's that idea of one, recognizing there's different types of leaders for different types of people, but then two, whatever kind of leader you are, have conviction in that. I think the reason why a leader like Jordan, did so well is because he had really strong conviction in who he was as a leader, right? He never wavered from that. And so people knew what they were going to get. And if they didn't like it, they found a different leader, right? But at least they knew exactly what they were going to get. Same thing with somebody like Greg Popovich. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
Greg Pop is a different leader, right? He's a different type of leader, but he's consistent, and people gravitate towards that consistency and his style.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a level of competence, right, that they have, right, in those two examples. Jordan could back up what he was asking of himself and others, right?
Right.
And so can Popovich, right? You have a skill set that and then that's not to be taken for granted, but at that level, that's that they have that level of skill. Then it's what can you do with that consistency and type of leadership style, right? One of the questions I ask people, I'm doing some stuff with the Air Force pilots, and I'll ask the instructors, I'm like, the question number one, do you think this person can be a pilot? If the answer is no, then it's why. Is it a skill thing or is it an attitude thing? And then we start breaking it down, right? Because if they have the the comp develop and become great. If they if it's something else, if it's more in that X factor thing of like attitude, work ethic, something else that uh, you know then we can work with that, right? Potentially. So yeah, I think once you have that skill base, then it matters what kind of cultural and environmental and leadership style we're bringing to the table. But going back to one of the things you said about that extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic, I love that, right? Because we know extrinsic motivations work. The problem is they're short lived, right? And so Jordan
Right.
would have to
Right.
find each week, right, or each month something else to like get under his skin
Yeah.
to then amp himself up, right? It reminds me, I mean, maybe you've heard this before, but in Bogota, Colombia, in the '90s, uh, there was a big problem with jaywalking, and the mayor hired mimes to walk behind the jaywalkers and mimic them, and it decreased jaywalking by like 60%. And
Oh
which
my
there's
gosh.
a lot of economic cost to jaywalking, right? From people getting into accidents, but slowing
Right.
traffic, bus route, pollution, etc. So like it was a big problem, economic problem, and so that was his solution, was to use an extrinsic motivator of shame
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
change the behavior, right? And I loved it. I love that example, and yeah, I think they can be just as effective. We just have to find the right ones and use them in the right dosage. I think it's sometimes
Yeah.
we try to overuse the external motivators.
Yeah, exactly. Or the internal, right? And so I think
Yeah.
the idea of like the idea of just shaming people into use the crosswalk is great. Jordan used a lot of shame, as we saw throughout the video.
Yeah.
That guy Scott Burrell, I feel bad for him. He seemed to take a lot of that heat. The other story that I really liked that wasn't covered too in depth, it was covered a little bit, was how many people tried to get close to Jordan, and how many people in the NBA wanted to learn from him, and they would do anything they could to get kind of near him. And eventually they faded away for one of two reasons. They either A, saw how hard it was, right, to
Yeah.
like do what Jordan was asking them to do, or he basically just kind of decided that they don't have it, they don't really want it. And the one person that broke through was Kobe. and
Yeah.
and and Jordan, as he talked about, he's sort of pestering. Like at first, it was like kind of this little brother, and then eventually it turned into love. But to me, that idea of you know, one, everybody wants to learn from the best, but are you willing to put in the work? Are you really willing to do what he or she asks you to do? You want to learn from the best in your field or in your sport. Are you really willing to do the work? And so when you were
Yeah.
talking about that skill, is it skill or is it attitude? I often think, is it skill or is it will? Right? That's a common phrase. Um, and I think it's easier to work with skill than it is with will. And so a lot of people,
Right.
I think you've heard me say these three questions. What do you want? How bad do you want it? And what are you willing to do to get it? And that was something that was really inspiring to me to see from just a little bit in the video, and then some other articles I read, that Kobe was willing to do what he needed to do to get it. And he took a lot of
Yeah.
heat
And
for it. Like he would make the bus wait, you know what I mean, like as a rookie.
right. Yeah. I your three questions are so appropriate. Like, it gets at the heart of the matter, and like, what are you willing to do to get there? And then I think the other piece is being mindful of like what's that's going to do to you, right? And so like we worked with a lot of
Yeah.
elite performers in a lot of areas, and there's not a lot of balance in somebody's life if they're going after a pursuit like that. And there's nothing wrong with going after that pursuit. However, be mindful of what that means, right? In all aspects, not just from that performance, but hey, if you're waiting longer, right? What is that going to do to relationships? What is that going to do to personal relationships, to other hobbies that you might have? And how are you going to navigate that, right? And I think sometimes we forget that, and that's where some of the challenges come from. Is people say they want it, and then what they realize what they have to give up, it's like, I don't know if I really want to
Right.
go down
Right.
that path. Yeah.
My friend JF, he talks about, he's a sports psych guy in in Canada and does a lot of work down here as well. But he talks about how, for them, it's not even a sacrifice. Like it doesn't
Right.
cross their mind. Like, I'm not sacrificing the school dance. To them, it's a
Right.
choice. Like, I'm choosing this life, this workout, or
Right.
this whatever it is, because I want to, because I'm driven by that. I don't feel like
Yeah.
I'm missing out or losing something. I think we outsiders project that onto them and say,
Yeah.
don't you
For
feel
sure.
bad? You missed out on the school dances and proms, or no, I don't feel bad. Like, I went
Yeah.
after what I wanted. I put in the work. I made the choices along the way.
Yeah.
And so I think for people to understand that it's not so much this sort of sacrifice that they're sitting up at night going, do I go to the school dance or do I work out in the
Yeah.
morning?
Yeah.
That
They're not
to
even
them, it's
thinking
just
about it.
clear. They're not even thinking about it. It's just a clear,
Yeah.
a clear, and I was going to say choice, but it's not even a choice. Like, it's, to them, it's not an option, because
Right.
it's something that's part of the process to get what they want, and they've bought into
Yeah.
that, to that script.
Yeah. I had a guest last week on, a former Major League Baseball player, and he played 8 years in the big leagues. And he was talking about transitioning and some of the things would have, liked to have done to help in his transition. When you're so focused and that becomes your identity, and that's what you, at some point, sports does come to an end, right? For all athletes, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, I'm very holistic. I want people to have a purposeful life, right? Within their sport, if we're talking about athletes, but also just in general, right? And so, what would you say, right? Because that's a hard shift. You're so hyper focused on becoming the best at your craft. And this is not just true for sports. This is true for some of the military folks that we work with, but also CEOs or business executives. What could they do to prep themselves for any kind of other transition that they may have in their lives? Because if we get so bogged down in that identity and then that identity goes away, what do we do?
I've thought about this in a number of different ways. I was actually talking with a former, a retired Navy SEAL friend of mine, about this a while back, and I said, when you were going through BUDS, like, which is the selection course for Navy SEALs, did you have a plan B? Like, were you thinking like, okay, I've got to, like, I'm putting all my eggs in this basket. This doesn't work out. Like, what am I going to do next? And he looked at me like I had three eyes, and sometimes I do, but he looked at me like I have three eyes, and he said, no, there was no plan B. There was
Right.
no out. In my mind, it was either this or nothing. And in some regard, like he would say, it was either this or death. And
Right.
I think that is a kind of a unique way of thinking about stuff. Most of us like to have a contingency plan or like a safety net, or if it doesn't work, then I have an idea of where I'll go and what I'll do. So I think if you have that mentality where you're comfortable with this sort of plan B, if it doesn't work, the transition out of sport or out of whatever your expertise is in is a little bit easier. It's a little bit softer. If you're more of a single focus gal or guy, that transition becomes a little bit more difficult. And so I think for many people in many sport organizations, it's being aware that for athletes especially, a transition out of sport is coming, right? For football players,
Yeah.
in the NFL, the average career span is 3 years, right? So I think for them, there's a recognition that a transition is coming. So how can I use my time now to set myself up without sacrificing the attention that my craft demands and
Right.
needs? I don't know if I'm really answering your question here, but I think it kind
No,
of,
no.
and it's sort of a cop out, but I think it kind of depends on the person's mentality. If they're more of a single focus person, the transition is going to be harder. And so,
Yeah.
sort of planting that seed earlier on might do more damage to them. Whereas somebody
Right.
that is more comfortable with plan B and plan C and contingency planning and all that, planting that seed earlier on might not have as much of a negative impact, as it would with the other group.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's because we're seeing other people doing things, particularly in like the elite military groups, like Navy SEALs, Green Berets. Like, I mean, there's so many coming out with different products or services that they're leveraging their experience to help, and create businesses for themselves, right? Which I don't know if a decade ago or 2 decades ago that was even a thing. And same with athletes, right? Athletes, even high performing athletes, are transitioning into other venues, leveraging whether it's personality, their celebrity, or their experience into these other domains. Um, I wonder, like a Seth Curry, right? Like he's still at the top of his game, and LeBron James, right? Like they're at the top of their game, but they're also starting to put their hands in
Amazing.
other things, right? Which is, I would imagine, and this is me being predictive, I have no idea, their transition is going to be a little smoother, right? As compared to even a Michael Jordan, right? Who obviously was very successful, has been successful afterwards, but that changing what we're doing and kind of that mentality. I'm just, obviously I have no idea how that all pan out, but it'll be interesting to see a LeBron or a Curry.
Yeah, and I think many of them, if you talk about the NBA, many of them talked about how Kobe had made that transition wonderfully. He was like one of the best at making that transition without sacrificing the on-court ability and execution of his craft. I think the other thing, like, not to like plug my podcast, but hit the link below and subscribe.
Plug away.
Yeah, right. But on the first episode, I talked with Gary Denham, who's a retired Navy SEAL. And one of the things that he talked about was like his identity was so wrapped up into being a Navy SEAL. Like that's who he was. I think it sort of came before his name even, like when he would introduce himself to people. But one of the things that he talked about in making that transition was uncovering and exposing the values that drive him within his identity of being a Navy SEAL. If he looked beneath the surface of just the identity, what are the values that drive me? What do I really love to do? And once he was able to kind of expose those and explore those, then making a transition was easier. I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was easier out of that. And certainly transitions that are forced due to injury or COVID are going to be more difficult, and there's going to be a grieving period that I think us as performance coaches and practitioners need to expect and support people through. Whereas like kind of a known transition, one that is coming, like it's your senior year, or it's you're kind of nearing the end of your NBA or NFL career. Those you can prepare for and set up for a little bit more. I think LeBron and Steph are such great examples because what they're doing and what they've done throughout their NBA career is obviously, like LeBron, I think he wears that shirt more than a basketball player, is they're doing way more. Like, they're into they want to have creative expression, and they do that on the court, obviously, and then they find ways to do that off the court. So I think it's kind of looking beneath the surface of not just what do I love about like the specific, craft or performance domain that I'm in, but why do I love those things about it? So it could be creativity or whatever.
And behind the values.
Exactly.
The reasons behind the values. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. We've already been talking for an hour. I always love our conversations, because I learned so much from you and
likewise.
Examples. It's great. So tell us, you plug the podcast, but plug it again. Like, where can people find you? Tell us what you're up to, what projects you have going on.
Okay. Yeah. So the podcast is called Coaching Through Stories, Lessons in Leadership and High Performance. It's on Apple and Spotify right now. And a good place to find out more about me and about the podcast is HigherEchelon.com. You can see it there below in the little banner there, HigherEchelon.com. And so those are the two bigger projects that we're working on right now. Is that podcast, and then of course our work with government and commercial organizations on high performance leadership and all things organizational performance, really. So those would be the two places. And then if you want to go on my Instagram and see some pictures of my kids, I think I'm at Dr. Eric Bean. I got a couple motivational things in there occasionally, maybe some podcast stuff. but it's mostly
Yeah.
pictures of my kids and maybe some old ones of me
All
golfing.
right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Check out the podcast, Coaching Through Stories. It's a great listen. Definitely learn a lot. He's got some great guests, and then also when you do your straight up stories and tie those to performance skills, it's a great opportunity to learn some new information in a different way.
Yeah.
So thanks again. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me on, Robert. Good to see you, man.